An ordinary day at the airport turned into an unforgettable lesson when police arrested a man wearing a MAGA hat, unaware of his true identity. What followed was a revelation that would change everything for the officers, the department, and the community they served. The buzz of activity at the bustling international airport created a low hum that hung in the air. Families reunited at baggage claim. Flight announcements echoed through the terminals, and travelers rushed to their gates, dragging wheeled suitcases behind them. Amid the chaos stood an elderly man, quietly observing the scene. His red "Make America Great Again" had sat firmly on his head, and his weathered hands gripped the handle of a small suitcase. He wore a maroon jacket, the kind that spoke of years of use, over a neatly pressed shirt. His demeanor was calm, almost detached, as if he was used to fading into the background. Gerald Hawthorne wasn't in a rush. He was waiting for someone who wasn't coming anytime soon, though he didn't mind. His years as a police officer, and later as chief, had taught him patience, the art of watching and listening. But to those passing by, Gerald wasn't just an elderly man minding his business. The bright red hat on his head had become more than a symbol. It was polarizing, and for some, alarming. Across the terminal, a young woman whispered to her companion, pointing discreetly in Gerald's direction. "He's been standing there for too long," she said, clutching her handbag nervously. "It's suspicious." Her companion shrugged. "He's just an old guy." But the woman wasn't convinced. In today's world, she thought, you couldn't be too careful. She glanced at Gerald again, noting his stillness, his lack of interaction with others. Before long, she flagged down one of the airport security officers patrolling nearby. The officer, a man in his late 20s named Officer Hayes, listened to her concerns, his expression growing serious as she spoke. Officer Hayes walked toward Gerald with measured steps, signaling to his partner, Officer Keller, to follow. They exchanged a quick glance before positioning themselves in front of Gerald, their uniforms crisp and authoritative. "Excuse me, sir," Hayes began, his voice firm but polite. "Do you have a moment?" Gerald looked up, his gray eyebrows lifting slightly in surprise. "Of course," he said, his voice steady and kind. "How can I help you?" "We've received a report about some unusual behavior," Hayes continued, glancing at Keller for confirmation. "Can you tell us why you've been standing here for so long?" Gerald's lips curved into a faint smile. "Unusual, you say? I'm just waiting for my grandson to arrive. His flight's delayed." Hayes nodded but didn't drop his professional demeanor. "Do you have your ID with you, sir?" "Certainly," Gerald replied, reaching into the pocket of his jacket. He moved slowly, mindful of the tension radiating from the officers. He pulled out his driver's license and handed it to Hayes. The officer examined the ID, his brow furrowing slightly. "Gerald Hawthorne," he murmured, glancing up at the man. "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes," Gerald replied, his voice calm but measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" At that moment, Keller leaned closer to Hayes, her voice a whisper. "The hat, the demeanor it matches. The description we got earlier about someone acting suspiciously near security. Could be nothing but—" Hayes hesitated. There was nothing particularly threatening about the man before him. But in an airport, they couldn't afford to take chances. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, handing back the ID, "would you mind coming with us for a few more questions?" "Just routine." Gerald tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Routine, you say? All right, lead the way." As Hayes and Keller escorted Gerald toward the security office, they couldn't ignore the growing number of eyes on them. Travelers paused mid-stride to watch the scene unfold. Some took out their phones, capturing videos or snapping photos. To the casual observer, it looked like law enforcement apprehending a potentially dangerous individual. Gerald remained composed, walking steadily between the two officers. He didn't resist, didn't argue. His silence spoke volumes, though the officers mistook it for submission rather than a calculated choice. Behind them, a small boy tugged on his father's sleeve. "What did that man do?" he asked, his voice loud enough to draw even more attention. The father shook his head. "Don't know, son, but they wouldn't take him if he didn't do something." The murmurs grew louder as the trio disappeared through a side door, leaving behind a terminal abuzz with speculation. The room was small and windowless, with plain white walls and a single metal table flanked by two chairs. Gerald sat on one side, his hands resting on the tabletop. Hayes and Keller stood opposite him, their stances rigid. "Mr. Hawthorne," Hayes began, flipping open a notebook. "Can you explain why you were loitering near the baggage claim?" "I wasn't loitering," Gerald replied calmly. "I was waiting for my grandson, as I said." "And you didn't interact with anyone during that time?" Keller pressed, her tone sharper than her partner's. "No," Gerald said simply. "I wasn't aware that sitting quietly was grounds for interrogation." Hayes shifted uncomfortably, aware of the weight in Gerald's words. But Keller pushed on. "We're not interrogating you, sir. We're just trying to understand why your presence caused concern." Gerald leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on the two officers. "Perhaps it wasn't my presence, but rather my hat that caused concern." Gerald leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on the two officers. "Perhaps it wasn't my presence, but rather my hat that caused concern." Hayes glanced at the bright red MAGA hat sitting on the table, next to Gerald's belongings. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, but he didn't acknowledge it. Keller, on the other hand, crossed her arms defensively. "We don't make assumptions based on appearances," she said, her voice tight. Gerald's lips twitched, but he didn't respond. Instead, he let the silence stretch, forcing the officers to fill the void. As the minutes ticked by, the officers began to feel the weight of the situation. Gerald's calm demeanor was disarming, his presence almost commanding despite his unassuming appearance. Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. Meanwhile, Keller examined Gerald's belongings, pulling out a wallet from his satchel. She opened it, revealing several cards, including a well-worn identification card from a local police academy. Her brow furrowed as she read the name on the card, Chief Gerald Hawthorne. "Hayes," she said, her voice low but urgent. "You might want to see this." Hayes stepped closer, his eyes widening as he read the card. He looked at Gerald, then back at the card, his mind racing. "Chief Hawthorne," he said slowly, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. "As in the former chief of the Elmwood Police Department." Gerald didn't answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I was wondering how long it would take you to figure that out." The realization hit Hayes and Keller like a freight train. They had just detained their city's former police chief, a man revered for his decades of service and dedication to the community. The room seemed to shrink as the weight of their mistake settled over them. "We didn't realize," Hayes began, his voice faltering. "Sir, if we had known." "You didn't," Gerald interrupted gently. "And that's the point." Keller's face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, we were just following protocol. We didn't mean any disrespect." "I know," Gerald said, his tone kind but firm. "But you assumed the worst. Not because of anything I did, but because of how I looked or what I wore. That's something you'll need to reflect on." Hayes nodded, his face pale. "You're right, sir. We'll make this right." Gerald stood, his movements deliberate and calm. "Making it right isn't about me. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to someone else. Someone who might not have the privilege of wearing this badge." As Gerald walked out of the holding room, now free to go, the officers exchanged a look of shame and determination. They had made a mistake that wouldn't be easily forgotten. But Gerald's quiet dignity had planted a seed of change, one that would grow in the acts to come. The quiet holding room in the airport's security office was far removed from the bustling energy of the terminal outside. Gerald Hawthorne, sitting calmly in the cold metal chair, studied the two officers standing across from him. They had yet to realize who he was, and he wasn't in any rush to enlighten them. His calm demeanor unnerved them, though neither Officer Hayes nor Officer Keller would admit it. Keller, holding her clipboard tightly, broke the silence. "Mr. Hawthorne, we need to get a better understanding of your presence here today. Can you tell us why you've been standing at the baggage claim area for such an extended period?" Gerald's lips curled into a small, bright smile. "I've already told you, officer. I'm waiting for my grandson. He's flying in from Seattle, and his flight was delayed." Hayes, seated to Gerald's left, glanced at Keller as if to confirm her next move. Keller nodded slightly, signaling him to continue. "We understand that, sir," Hayes said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "But some passengers expressed concerns about your behavior. Can you explain why you didn't engage with anyone while you were waiting? Most people waiting for a delayed flight grab a coffee, use their phone, or sit down somewhere." Gerald raised an eyebrow. "Is standing quietly a crime now?" The room fell silent again, and Gerald leaned back in his chair, He could feel the tension in the air, but his years of experience had taught him the value of patience. He watched as Hayes shuffled uncomfortably in his seat, while Keller scribbled notes on her clipboard, her pen scratching loudly against the paper. Keller leaned forward, her expression hardening. "Mr. Hawthorne, we're not saying you've committed a crime, but we need to evaluate all possibilities. Airports are sensitive locations, and it's our job to ensure the safety of everyone here." Gerald nodded slowly. "I understand. You have a job to do. But it seems to me that your concern isn't with my actions. It's with my appearance." Keller frowned. "What do you mean by that?" "The hat," Gerald said simply, motioning to the red MAGA hat sitting on the table beside his wallet. "People see that, and assumptions follow. It's not the first time." Hayes opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Keller, however, pressed on. "We don't make judgments based on appearances, Mr. Hawthorne. Don't you?" Gerald asked, his tone even. He leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I've spent my life teaching officers how to look past appearances, how to see people for who they are, not what they're wearing. It's disappointing to see how quickly that lesson gets forgotten." Hayes shifted in his seat, the weight of Gerald's words settling heavily on his shoulders. He turned to Keller, lowering his voice. "I feel like we're missing something here." Keller glanced at him, her frown deepening. "What are you suggesting?" "I don't know," Hayes admitted, "but something about this guy feels off. He doesn't seem like someone we should be treating like a suspect." Keller sighed, exasperated. "We're not treating him like a suspect. We're following protocol. Let's stick to the facts." Hayes nodded reluctantly, but couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut. Turning back to Gerald, he asked, "Sir, do you have any additional identification on you? Something that might help us verify your identity more thoroughly?" Gerald reached for his leather satchel, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out his wallet and handed it to Hayes without a word. Hayes opened it, sifting through the cards, until his eyes landed on a worn badge, tucked into one of the compartments. He froze, staring at the badge, his mind racing. "Chief Gerald Hawthorne," Hayes read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elmwood Police Department, retired." Keller's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "What?" Hayes handed her the badge, his hand trembling slightly. "He's a retired police chief. From our city." The air in the room shifted instantly. Keller stared at the badge, her face pale. Memories began to surface, stories told by older officers about a legendary chief who had transformed the department, implementing reforms that were now standard practice. The name Gerald Hawthorne had always been spoken with reverence, but she had never expected to meet the man under these circumstances. Gerald watched the two officers closely, his expression unreadable. "You figured it out, I see." Hayes looked up, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir, we didn't know it was you." Gerald leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "And if I wasn't me? If I was just another old man waiting for his grandson, would that have changed the way you treated me?" Keller swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "Sir, we were just following procedure." "Procedure?" Gerald repeated, his tone laced with disappointment. "Procedure should include respect. It should include critical thinking. It should include remembering that the people you're questioning are just that people." While Hayes and Keller grappled with their realization, Gerald's legacy began to surface in other corners of the airport. Word of the incident spread quickly, reaching members of the Elmwood Police Department who were stationed nearby. Officer Ramirez, an older member of the department who had served under Gerald, overheard the news and rushed to the security office. When Ramirez entered the room, his face lit up with recognition. "Chief Hawthorne!" he exclaimed, his voice a mixture of shock and delight. Gerald smiled faintly. "Ramirez, it's been a while. What are you doing here?" Ramirez asked, his eyes darting between Hayes and Keller. "Why are you in here?" "That's a good question," Gerald replied, his tone calm but pointed. Ramirez turned to Hayes and Keller, his expression darkening. "Do you two have any idea who this man is?" "This is the reason half our department knows how to do their jobs. He's the one who trained me, who taught me what it means to serve." Hayes and Keller exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of their mistake growing heavier by the second. As the situation de-escalated, Hayes and Keller couldn't escape the sting of their actions. They had treated Gerald with suspicion, failing to see the man behind the MAGA hat for Hayes. The incident sparked a deep sense of regret. He thought about his father's stories of Chief Hawthorne, of the man who had built the department's foundation of integrity and trust. Keller, meanwhile, wrestled with her own defensiveness. She prided herself on her professionalism. But Gerald's calm critique had pierced through her armor. She realized how easily assumptions could cloud judgment, even for someone as disciplined as herself. The two officers apologized to Gerald, their voices earnest but strained. Gerald accepted their apologies with grace but offered no words of comfort. Instead, he left them with a single statement. Mistakes are only forgivable if you learn from them. As Gerald left the holding room, escorted by Ramirez, Hayes and Keller remained behind, lost in their thoughts. The gravity of their error had shaken them to their core, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about their approach to the job. For Gerald, the experience was another reminder of how far the department still had to go. He had spent his life building a culture of respect and accountability, but that culture required constant vigilance. And now, it was up to the next generation of officers to carry that torch. As Gerald Hawthorne left the holding room, escorted by Officer Ramirez, the impact of his revelation continued to ripple through the airport security office. Officers Hayes and Keller remained seated in stunned silence, the badge still lying on the cold metal table between them. The weight of their actions bore down on them, and the room seemed smaller, more oppressive. Hayes broke the silence first, running a hand through his short hair. "We screwed up," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not just a little, a lot." Keller stared at the badge, the realization of their actions dawning slowly. "We treated him like he was nobody," she said, her tone laced with guilt. "And he's the one who built the department we work for." The significance of what had just happened began to settle fully. They hadn't just detained an innocent man. They had detained a man who had devoted his entire life to upholding the very values they had ignored. But the revelation of Gerald's identity wasn't just about their mistake. It was about the stark reminder of how quickly assumptions could cloud judgment, even in the people who were supposed to rise above them. Word of the incident spread quickly beyond the airport walls. Gerald's quiet detainment and the subsequent discovery of his identity became the talk of the Elmwood Police Department. It didn't take long for Lieutenant Marshall to hear about it, and when he did, his reaction was immediate and fiery. "Are you telling me?" he barked into the phone. "That two of our own just detained Chief Gerald Hawthorne in an airport holding cell because of a damn hat?" The officer on the other end stammered an explanation. But Marshall wasn't interested in excuses. He slammed the phone down and grabbed his jacket, heading straight for the airport. Gerald had been his mentor, the man who had taught him everything he knew about leadership and integrity. The thought of him being treated like a criminal was unthinkable. When Marshall arrived at the airport, the scene in the security office was tense. Officers stood in small groups, murmuring to one another, their faces etched with disbelief and embarrassment. Marshall's presence silenced the room instantly. "Where is he?" Marshall demanded. Hayes stepped forward hesitantly. "Lieutenant, he left the holding room." Officer Ramirez escorted him to the terminal. "And you two?" Marshall turned his piercing gaze on Hayes and Keller. "What do you have to say for yourselves?" Keller swallowed hard, her voice trembling slightly. "Sir, we didn't know it was him. He didn't say anything. He just sat there and let us make the mistake." Marshall's eyes narrowed. "And what does that tell you?" "That we were wrong," Hayes said quietly. "That we judged him based on what he was wearing, not who he was." Marshall's voice softened slightly, though his frustration was still evident. "You weren't just wrong. You failed. Not just him, but the principles he spent his life teaching us." Meanwhile, Gerald found a quiet corner of the airport terminal, away from the prying eyes of travelers and officers alike. Officer Ramirez lingered nearby, unsure whether to stay or leave. Gerald waved him off gently. "Go back to your post, Ramirez. I'll be fine." Ramirez hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir. If you need anything." Gerald smiled faintly. "I know where to find you." As Ramirez walked away, Gerald leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. The events of the past few hours replayed in his mind, each moment a sharp reminder of how much had changed since his days in uniform. He thought about Hayes and Keller, their nervous energy, their inability to see him for who he was. He didn't blame them entirely. He knew the pressures of the job, the way it could harden even the most well-intentioned officers. But he couldn't ignore the deeper issue their actions revealed. For decades, Gerald had worked to instill a culture of respect and accountability within the Elmwood Police Department. He had fought against prejudice, pushed for better training, and demanded that his officers see every individual as a human being first and foremost. And yet, here he was, treated as a threat simply because of a hat and a few moments of silence. The irony wasn't lost on him. Back in the security office, Marshall gathered Hayes, Keller, and a few other officers for an impromptu meeting. His voice was calm but firm, his words carefully chosen. Gerald Hawthorne isn't just a former chief, Marshall began. He's the reason this department has the reputation it does today. Without him, half of us wouldn't even be here. And today, we failed him. Hayes nodded slowly. I know, sir, I didn't see it until it was too late. That's the problem, Marshall said. You didn't see it. You didn't ask the right questions. You let your assumptions guide you instead of your training. And if this can happen to Gerald Hawthorne, it can happen to anyone. Keller shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sir, with all due respect, he could have told us who he was. He didn't have to let it get this far. Marshall fixed her with a steely gaze. And what would that have changed? If he told you he was the former chief, would you have treated him differently? Would you have apologized? Let him go? Or would you have questioned why he didn't reveal himself sooner? Keller fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. This isn't about him, Marshall continued. This is about us, our biases, our blind spots. If we can't acknowledge them, we have no business wearing this badge. The incident became more than just a moment of embarrassment for the department. It became a catalyst for change. Gerald's quiet dignity in the face of their mistakes forced the officers to confront their own shortcomings in a way that no training manual or lecture ever could. In the days that followed, Chief Banks called an emergency meeting of the department's leadership team. Gerald, at her invitation, attended the meeting as a guest speaker. Standing at the front of the room, he addressed the officers with the same calm authority that had defined his career. I didn't come here to lecture you, Gerald began. I didn't come here to demand apologies or seek justice. I came here because what happened at the airport isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about how easy it is to let fear and assumptions dictate our actions. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. I spent my career teaching officers to see beyond appearances, to ask questions, to think critically. But those lessons don't stick unless we're willing to examine ourselves constantly, to admit when we're wrong, to do better. The room was silent, every officer hanging on his words. I was lucky, Gerald said. Lucky because I had the privilege of wearing this badge for so many years. But what about the people who don't? What about the ones who never get the chance to explain themselves? Who are judged and dismissed without a second thought? That's the real issue, and it's up to us to fix it. As Gerald finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Officers who had never met him before stood alongside. Those who had worked under him, united in their respect and admiration. But Gerald didn't bask in the applause. Instead, he quietly gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, his role in the meeting complete. Before he could go, Hayes and Keller approached him, their expressions a mix of guilt and determination. Sir, Hayes began, his voice shaky. We just want to say we're sorry. We made a mistake, a big one. Gerald studied them for a moment, then nodded. You did. But what matters now is what you do next. Keller swallowed hard, her voice breaking slightly. We'll do better. We promise. Gerald's lips curved into a faint smile. Good, because this badge isn't just a symbol. It's a responsibility. Don't forget that. As Gerald left the meeting, the department began to buzz with renewed energy. The officers knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it head-on. Gerald's presence had reminded them of what they stood for and what they had to strive toward. The airport security office was a flurry of activity as officers moved in and out, trying to navigate the fallout from the earlier events. However, in a quiet corner of the terminal, Gerald Hawthorne sat in peaceful solitude. The man who had once commanded an entire police department now found himself quietly reflecting on the day's events, the MAGA hat still resting on his lap, as if it carried the weight of the misunderstandings that had unfolded. Gerald was not one to seek confrontation, and that was precisely why he had remained silent in the holding room. It wasn't defiance. It was a choice, a deliberate decision. to see how far the officers would take their assumptions. What had unfolded was not shocking to him, but it was a stark reminder of the work that still needed to be done. Even in the department he had once led, he thought about the years he'd spent building a culture of trust and accountability, of tirelessly advocating for better training, and pushing for policies that emphasized compassion over judgment. Yet here he was, not as a symbol of what the system could achieve, but as a reminder of its flaws. It wasn't bitterness that filled his thoughts, but a profound sense of responsibility. Even in retirement, Gerald realized his work was far from over. Back in the security office, Officers Hayes and Keller were grappling with their emotions. The full weight of their mistake had begun to sink in, and the shame was almost unbearable. Hayes, usually confident and collected, sat with his head in his hands, replaying every moment of their interaction with Gerald. "I can't believe we did that," he muttered, his voice thick with regret. Keller, pacing back and forth, was less emotional but no less affected. "We followed protocol," she said, as if trying to convince herself. "We didn't know who he was. How could we?" Hayes looked up at her, his eyes red. "That's the point. It shouldn't have mattered who he was, whether he's a former chief or just some old man waiting for his grandson. We shouldn't have treated him like that." Keller stopped pacing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wanted to argue, but she couldn't. Hayes was right. Their actions hadn't aligned with the values they had sworn to uphold. And now they had to face the consequences, not just from their department, but from within themselves. Lieutenant Marshall arrived at the security office, his presence commanding as always. He immediately sought out Hayes and Keller, his expression unreadable. "We're going to fix this," he said simply, his voice low but resolute. "Not just for Chief Hawthorne, but for the department and everyone we serve." Hayes and Keller nodded, their shame palpable. "What can we do, sir?" Hayes asked, his voice trembling slightly. Marshall took a deep breath. "You're going to start by owning your mistake. Both of you. No excuses, no justifications. You'll apologize to Chief Hawthorne, and then you'll work with me to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." Keller frowned slightly, still struggling with the idea of being so publicly accountable. "And what about Chief Banks?" she asked. "What's her response?" "She's already issued a formal apology to Chief Hawthorne," Marshall replied. "And she's called for an immediate review of our training protocols. But this isn't about saving face. It's about doing the right thing." Hayes and Keller found Gerald sitting quietly near the gate where his grandson was due to arrive. The sight of him, calm and composed, only made their guilt more profound. They approached slowly, unsure how to begin. "Chief Hawthorne," Hayes said softly, his voice shaky. "Can we speak with you for a moment?" Gerald looked up, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Of course," he said, gesturing for them to sit. Hayes hesitated, but Keller took the lead. "Sir," she began, her voice steady but filled with regret, "we want to apologize. We made a mistake, a serious mistake, and we're deeply sorry for the way we treated you." Hayes nodded, his hands fidgeting nervously. "We let our assumptions get the better of us, and we failed to treat you with the respect you deserve. Not because you're the former chief, but because you're a person. We're sorry." Gerald studied them for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. Then he nodded. "Apology accepted," he said simply. "But I want you to understand something. This isn't just about me. It's about every person you'll encounter in this job. Every decision you make, every assumption you let guide you, it affects lives. You have to be better. Not just for me, but for everyone who depends on you to do your job with integrity." The officers nodded, their expressions solemn. Gerald's words carried the weight of decades of experience, and they knew they would carry those words with them for the rest of their careers. Later that day, the Elmwood Police Department issued a public statement about the incident, acknowledging the mistake and vowing to take immediate steps to address the issues it had revealed. Chief Banks held a press conference, her tone measured but firm. "What happened at the airport was unacceptable," she said. "It was a failure on our part to uphold the values we strive to embody as a department. We have reached out to Chief Hawthorne to apologize personally and publicly, and we are committed to learning from this mistake." The press conference was met with mixed reactions. Some praised the department's transparency and willingness to take responsibility, while others criticized the incident as evidence of deeper systemic issues. Gerald watched the coverage from his home, his emotions a mixture of pride and frustration. He appreciated the department's efforts to make amends, but he knew this was just the beginning. Real change would require more than apologies and press conferences. It would require action. The department invited Gerald to speak at a special meeting of officers and community leaders, hoping his perspective could help guide the path forward. Gerald accepted, not because he sought recognition, but because he saw an opportunity to create meaningful change. When the day of the meeting arrived, the room was packed. Officers, city officials, and members of the public filled the seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Gerald stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding despite his unassuming appearance. "I'm not here to lecture you," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to share what this experience has taught me and, hopefully, what it can teach all of us." He spoke about the importance of humility, of seeing beyond appearances, and of the responsibility that came with wearing a badge. He didn't shy away from addressing the biases that had led to his detention, but he framed them as an opportunity for growth rather than a cause for shame. "We all have biases," he said. "What matters is what we do about them, how we confront them, challenge them, and work to overcome them. That's the real test of character, not just for officers, but for everyone." His words resonated deeply, sparking a standing ovation from the audience. But Gerald wasn't interested in applause. He was interested in action. In the weeks that followed, the department implemented new training programs focused on implicit bias, de-escalation, and community engagement. Hayes and Keller became vocal advocates for these programs, using their experience as a cautionary tale for their fellow officers. Gerald remained involved, serving as a mentor and advisor to the department he had once led. He saw the changes taking shape, slowly but surely, and it gave him hope. The incident at the airport had been a painful reminder of the work that still needed to be done, but it had also been a catalyst for growth. As Gerald watched the department evolve, he felt a sense of peace. His legacy wasn't just in the policies he had implemented or the officers he had trained. It was in the ongoing commitment to integrity and respect that he had fought for his entire career. The events at the airport had set off a ripple effect far beyond its immediate participants. Gerald Hawthorne, the man who once commanded the Elmwood Police Department with dignity and compassion, had turned a personal humiliation into a powerful teaching moment for everyone involved. But the story didn't end with apologies and training initiatives. It was just beginning. Weeks after the incident, the department's efforts to rebuild trust and reform its practices were well underway. Officers Hayes and Keller, who had once felt the crushing weight of shame, now found themselves leading by example. Their experience had forced them to confront their own biases, and they were determined to ensure that no one else would suffer the indignity they had inflicted on Gerald or anyone else. But this wasn't just their story. It was the story of a department, a community, and the lessons one man had spent his life trying to impart. Gerald, though reluctant at first, found himself drawn back into the world he had left behind. He began attending community meetings, workshops, and training sessions at the department's invitation. His presence wasn't just symbolic, it was transformative. People listened when Gerald spoke, not because of his title, but because of the respect he commanded through his humility and wisdom. At one such meeting, Gerald stood before a room of officers, community leaders, and concerned citizens. His voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't about me," he began. "What happened at the airport was just a symptom of a much larger problem. It's easy to talk about change, to draft policies, and hold meetings. But real change happens in the way we treat each other every single day. It happens in the decisions we make when no one is watching." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We wear these badges to serve and protect, not to judge and condemn. But we can't serve others until we've learned to see them for who they truly are, not for what they wear, where they come from, or what we think they might be." The room erupted into applause, but Gerald's expression remained serious. He wasn't here for praise. He was here to ensure that the lessons learned didn't fade into the background once the headlines died down. Meanwhile, Hayes and Keller were undergoing their own transformations. They had volunteered to share their story during training sessions, openly discussing their mistakes and what they had learned from the experience. At first, it was painful standing in front of their peers, and admitting their failures wasn't easy. But over time, they began to see the impact their honesty had on others. During one such session, Keller stood before a group of new recruits, her voice steady but filled with emotion. What happened that day wasn't just a mistake, it was a wake-up call. It showed me how easy it is to fall into the trap of assumptions, to let fear and bias cloud your judgment. But it also showed me the importance of accountability. Because if we can't admit when we're wrong, we have no business wearing this badge. Hayes nodded beside her. We're here to protect and serve, not to project our own fears onto others. Chief Hawthorne didn't deserve what we put him through, and neither does anyone else. That's why we're standing here today, to make sure that what happened to him never happens again. The recruits listened intently, their expressions a mixture of admiration and resolve. Hayes and Keller had turned their lowest moment into an opportunity to lead, and in doing so, they had regained the respect of their peers and of Gerald himself. Chief Banks had been deeply affected by the incident. Though she had issued a formal apology to Gerald, she knew that words alone weren't enough. Under her leadership, the department underwent a comprehensive review of its policies, focusing on implicit bias training, community outreach, and transparency. One of the most significant changes was the establishment of a community advisory board, composed of citizens, local leaders, and former officers like Gerald. The board's purpose was to ensure that the department remained accountable to the people it served and to provide a platform for open dialogue between officers and the community. At the inaugural meeting of the advisory board, Gerald was invited to speak. He looked around the room, taking in the diverse faces of those who had come together to create a better future. This is what progress looks like, he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Not perfection, but effort. Not promises, but actions. And most importantly, not division, but unity. His words were met with nods of agreement and quiet determination. The advisory board was a step in the right direction. But Gerald knew that the real work lay ahead. Months after the airport incident, Gerald returned to the Elmwood Police Department for the first time in years. The station had changed in some ways, new faces, new technology, but the core of its mission remained the same. As he walked through the familiar halls, memories flooded back, late nights spent reviewing cases, moments of camaraderie with his officers, and the countless challenges they had faced together. When he entered the briefing room, he was met with a surprise, a standing ovation from the assembled officers. Chief Banks stepped forward, a warm smile on her face. Chief Hawthorne, she said, addressing him formally, we owe you more than an apology. We owe you our gratitude for everything you've done for this department, and for the lessons you continue to teach us. Gerald nodded, his expression humble. I didn't do it alone, he said. The department is only as strong as the people who serve it, and I see a lot of strength in this room. Banks presented Gerald with a plaque commemorating his years of service and his ongoing contributions to the department. The gesture was heartfelt, but Gerald's true reward was seeing the changes that had begun to take root, changes he had spent his career fighting for. One evening, as Gerald was leaving a community meeting, he witnessed a confrontation between a young officer and a distressed man outside a convenience store. The man, clearly upset, was raising his voice, gesturing wildly. The officer, a rookie by the look of him, was tense but trying to remain calm. Gerald approached slowly, observing the scene. He saw the rookie take a deep breath, lowering his voice and speaking calmly to the man. The tension began to dissipate as the officer listened, nodding in understanding. Eventually, the man relaxed, and the situation resolved peacefully. The rookie turned to leave but stopped when he saw Gerald. Chief Hawthorne, he said, his eyes wide with recognition. I didn't know you were here. I was just passing by, Gerald said with a small smile. You handled that well. The rookie blushed slightly. Thank you, sir. I've been trying to focus on de-escalation techniques. It's something they've been emphasizing in training. Gerald nodded, his heart swelling with pride. Keep it up, he said. The badge doesn't make you strong, your character does. As Gerald walked home that evening, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. The road to progress was long and winding, but he could see the signs of change all around him in the department, in the community, and in the officers who had taken his lessons to heart. The airport incident had been a painful reminder of the work That still needed to be done. But it had also been a catalyst for transformation. Gerald's legacy wasn't just in the policies he had implemented or the officers he had trained. It was in the lives he had touched and the principles he had instilled.